Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on understanding carbon border adjustment mechanism and its impact on the Indian market. I think we will wait for a couple of more minutes for some more attendees, and then we can start the webinar. Good afternoon once again, and welcome to today's webinar on understanding CBAM and its impact on the Indian market. My name is Neha, and I'm the marketing manager at Olive Gaia. It's a privilege to have you join us as we explore the critical topic of EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism and its implication for the Indian industry. This session will provide valuable insights into navigating these regulations and identifying opportunities for sustainable growth. Now, before we begin, some housekeeping rules that I would like to share with everybody. Please use the Q&A feature to share your question, and we will address them during the dedicated Q&A session towards the end. You will receive an email with the slides after the session, so don't need to worry about the note-taking. If you have any technical issues or immediate concern, please feel free to use the chat function, and our team will assist you promptly. Now, allow me to briefly introduce you, Olive Gaia. We are a leading climate tech company based in the UAE and India, committed to closing the climate action gap and enabling businesses to achieve sustainability leadership. Beyond bespoke consulting services spanning from ESG and net zero strategies to carbon offsetting and life cycle analysis, Olive Gaia provides cutting-edge technology solutions and to enable real and science-based sustainability action. Olive Gaia's AI-driven SaaS platform Zero meets the growing requirement for carbon accounting and sustainability by fast-tracking decarbonization as well as ESG risk management and reporting. Since our inception in 2002, we have successfully collaborated with some of the largest government and private entities in the region. Our efforts and innovation have been recognized by esteemed organizations such as BCG and Google. Now, I would like to introduce our team members. Vivek Tripathi is our CEO and co-founder, and he brings nearly 2 decades of experience in leadership roles at renowned companies like Reliance and Baker Hughes. Jessica is our co-founder and CMO who has more than 15 years of expertise in PR, communication, and sustainability, coupled with a robust background in international affairs and public policy. Couple, who is our CTO, he leads the product development with over 20 years of experience in the tech sector. Oksana is our head of growth, and she's a sustainability leader with expertise in ESG transaction and net zero strategies. Raghu is our carbon emission expert, brings extensive knowledge in ESG and net zero emission. Abhishek is our growth leader and he specializes in sustainable finance and public policy. Saranya is our GHG analyst who has more than 5 years of experience in sustainability sector. Now, please allow me to welcome our speaker, Vivek Tripathi. Vivek's career is marked by impactful leadership and strategic acumen. As chief of staff at Reliance Industries, he provided direct counsel to the board, while at Cadence, he spearheaded international acquisition and LNG ventures as chief of strategy. At Baker Hughes, Vivek led 500 USD million transformation project for global clients like AD, NOC, and Saudi Aramco. Driven by commitment to sustainability, Vivek leverages his extensive experience to champion science-based climate action and make sustainable practice a standard in the business community. Our co-speaker for today is Pedro Balaguza. He's the CEO of Kickster Group. He has extensive experience in climate and sustainability policies, sustainable finance, disclosure framework like GRI, TCFD, etc., with specialization on ESG, risk evaluation, sustainability-linked financial products, and climate risk assessment and climate market mechanisms. With over 15 years of experience, Pedro has worked on CBAM projects for EU and now NEO companies and has contributed significantly to international frameworks like GHG accounting, MRV, and ETS. He has also served as an ambassador to the European Climate Pact for 2 years and is a member of several global sustainability councils. Our speaker's expertise will provide us with a comprehensive understanding of sustainable practices and strategies for navigating CBAM. I will just briefly walk you through today's agenda. We will begin by exploring the objective, sectors affected, and the timeline for CBAM implementation in the first 5 minutes. Next, we will discuss the essentials of embedded emission, the role of CBAM certificates, and the process for calculating emission across product categories. Following that, we will delve into strategies and best practices, including emission data tracking, supply chain engagement, and compliance steps tailored for Indian suppliers. Finally, we will conclude with a 15-minute Q&A session to address your queries. Now, without further ado, let me hand it over to Pedro, who will guide us through the fascinating world of CBAM. Pedro, over to you.
Thank you, Neha. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a big pleasure for me to be here today and talking about CBAM, which is a quite complicated topic because we should see CBAM from different points of view. And I know that also for Indian companies, a lot of Indian companies are struggling about the CBAM implication on their businesses. So I think today, Vivek and I will try to guide you, first of all, to understand what is CBAM about, and what are the consequences for Indian companies in the overall, I say, bigger picture of the climate policies and European climate policies. So as you might know, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, it's a new policy that was established by the European Union in a regulation dated 2023 that wants to put a price on the embedded emission of imported goods inside the European Commission. This was part of a bigger package, I would say, which is the Fit for 55 package. And in the name of the Fit for 55, we understand that there is this commitment of the European Union to reduce the GHG emission by 50% by 2030. And this was an increased ambition. It was discussed for many, many years at the European level, but also at the COP level. And finally, the European Commission, after the COVID and considering what was supposed to be done after the COVID to restart, let's say, the European economy, they decided to cut at least the emission by 55% in the next 6 years. The Indian goal that was declared in the last NDC, it's about 45%. And even if the numbers are not similar, I mean, are similar, but there is a gap, we also need to understand how the national policies, I mean, the European policies and the Indian policies are designed to achieve this goal, okay? So the basic aim of the CBAM is to address greenhouse gas emissions associated with certain imported goods, to prevent carbon leakage, to reduce global carbon emission, to support, of course, the goal of the Paris Agreement, and inside the European Union to ensure that all the sectors of the economy contribute to achieving the emission reduction outlined in a very specific regulation of the European Union. In the graph on the right side, you can easily understand how the CBAM works. We have some companies inside the European territory that probably are importing goods produced outside the European Union, and as you can see, something now is happening at the border. At the border now, non-EU supplier, and therefore also Indian company, should be able to give to their importers some information about the embedded emission of the goods they are exporting to the European Union. As you can see in the list, the European Union with the CBAM wants to achieve different kind of goals. And this is a main characteristic of the European Union approach toward climate policies. I mean, we have one major scope, but we consider the overall outlook. And one of the biggest topics for the European Union is to prevent carbon leakage. In the European Union, there is a very strong principle, which is polluters should pay. And therefore, we have, since 2005, since the Kyoto Protocol, an internal and regional market, the European ETS, which is assessing the reduction of the emission, but is also taking into consideration the risk of carbon leakage in two ways. We don't want European companies to relocate outside of the European Union and to continue emit CO2. And on the other side, we don't want that also these emissions that can be created outside of our territory are still being emitted. And this is quite complicated to be understood, because the European Union with the CBAM is basically giving an obligation to European companies, the European importers companies, but at the same time, to achieve the goal of the CBAM, the European importers need the cooperation of the exporters, because they have to report, and starting from 2026, they will need to pay also for the embedded emission of the imported goods. Going back a little bit to the climate negotiation, the COP29 just finished. I know that the Indian government is not very happy about what was decided about climate finance. The position of the Indian government is clear. And also in the last years, the Indian government was discussing with the European policymakers about the impact of the CBAM. Nevertheless, inside the Paris Agreement, dated 2015, the European Union decided really to go to lead, let's say, the climate fight and to reach some goals. The European Union decided several policies with the goal to be carbon neutral by 2050. Keep in mind also the 2050 goal, which is again different from the Indian ones, which is the carbon neutrality should be reached by 2070. And this makes a lot of sense also in the context of the climate negotiation, because each country should achieve in a different timeline the carbon neutrality, even if we really know that now it's very, very urgent. Maybe someone of you guys already know about the main goal of the Paris Agreement, which is to limit the average increase in the temperature above 2 degrees or even better at the 1.5. And we really know that now this goal it's very far from being achieved, because on the last statistic presented during the COP29, the average temperature has already increased to 1.49. And so we really need to speed up the process to fight the climate change. I mentioned already the 54-55 package, and it's very important for you to understand a little bit about how we do things in Europe. As I said, there is an ETS, so some companies, energy companies, high-emitting companies, have already an obligation to follow, let's say, a decarbonization pathway, and this is very clear, and they get, as of today, some free allowances, some right of emitting CO2. With the phasing of the CBAM, these free allowances will decrease, and we expect that in the next decade, there will be no more free allocation inside the European Union for ETS company. At the same time, the number of goods that are covered by the CBAM will increase. So this is just the beginning, because in the 54-55 package and in the small image that you can see here, there are really several different European policies covering different kind of economical sectors. As of today, there is a big relevance in the decarbonization pathways of high-emitting sectors. Recently, also, the European Commission created a new European ETS called ETS2, including other sectors. And this is the European view. We are covering all the sector with the same principle, who pollutes pay, and therefore we will also expect to increase the number of goods covered by the CBAM. There is a slight difference from the European approach on the European policies and the CBAM, because, as you might understand, the European Union can just regulate European companies. And so the European Union, when it was designing the CBAM, needed to find a solution to put a price on the carbon of the imports. And the only way was to identify some CN codes, so some goods that come inside the European Union, because it's not allowed, of course, to regulate companies outside of the European Union. So here you have the fundamental regulation about the CBAM. As I said before, in 2023, the CBAM regulation was officially published in the official journal of the EU. And a few months afterwards, in August 2023, it was also presented, the regulation for the transitional phase. It's very important to understand that during the CBAM phase-in, we have two different phases with different kind of obligation, but the scope of the regulation is very clear, and it is exactly the same. It's just an increasing, let's say, number of obligations that are arising, differentiating the transitional period and the final period. The transitional period, which started in October last year, it's a 27 months period, which basically was designed with the purpose to make the system works. So importers need to start to collect the information they need. There is no financial regulation, so they are not obliged now to buy CBAM certificates. And the basic point of the transitional period, it's, from my point of view, and this is actually what is happening, it's to start an engagement activities with the suppliers, because they need the data of the embedded emission from the suppliers, and not everybody, not all suppliers are already ready to give this information to the European importers. So besides the difference of the cost of the CBAM certificates, we don't have to surrender any CBAM certificates now as importers. The main goal, and this is what Vivek will talk about in the next minutes, it's for non-EU exporters, for Indian companies to understand the boundaries of the CBAM calculation, to understand why their importers are starting asking for some information, and how also this can impact the business. If we see at the data of the Indian exports, we basically find exactly what is in this slide. Indian companies are exporting to Europe iron and steel, and it is like, I think, around 76% of the exports to Europe. So it's a very big amount of goods, and it's a very big amount of money. They are exporting aluminum, they are exporting cement, they are exporting fertilizers, and this is exactly the categories of goods included in the CBAM regulation. First of all, we need to understand, as Indian exporters company, if we are exporting to Europe, some of the goods included in the regulation. In the regulation of the previous slide, you can find a clear list of the CN codes. So when you are exporting these goods related to cement production, iron and steel production, aluminum production, you need first to understand and to assess again this list. And keep in mind that probably the work that you will start doing to calculate the embedded emissions, it's very useful also in the next years, because we expect that the number of goods, the category of goods included in the CBAM regulation will be extended, as we know already that inside the European Union, we are extending, let's say, the coverage of our European policies. This is an example of the CN codes. I mean, these are the CN codes included in the CBAM regulation, and this is the objective assumption. Your goods will fall under the CBAM regulation. Therefore, the importer will ask you for the embedded emissions if you are exporting exactly this good to the European Union. And as we can see, this is very, very big. I will show you some data about the Indian export to Europe. So a lot of companies are need to engage in this activity to keep selling products to Europe. I remember two years ago when there was the first meeting from some non-EU countries with the European Union to talk about the CBAM, the very first question arising was, is this compliant with WTO? And WTO actually never said something, because as it is designed, it's WTO compliant. And after that, the European Union regulated the CBAM, let's say, also UK started thinking about a CBAM regulation, which is mirroring exactly the European one. Canada is doing something very, very similar to the EU CBAM. So, I mean, I think that the discussion at WTO level is closed. CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, are compliant with the provision of any trade organization's agreement, okay? Here I want to highlight the point of view for exporter. As you can see in the graph, there are a lot of obligations for importers, because we are regulating an activity which is due by the importer. They have to report the embedded emission, they have to do the custom declaration, they have to enroll inside the CBAM registry, they have a responsibility with the national competent authorities, but they need to get information on embedded emission from non-EU producers. And so you play a key role for your importers to be compliant. They have the liability, they have the responsibility of this, but they need your cooperation. And now European importers, European clients are evaluating suppliers in a different way, not only based on price of quality of goods imported, but also about the level of the embedded emission, because for each ton of CO2 embedded in the goods, they will need to surrender CBAM certificates starting from 2026, and they need to buy these CBAM certificates. I will show you a little bit also the price dynamic, but this is to say that embedded emission will be the new competitive, let's say, element for all the non-EU producers, the non-EU suppliers. And there is a third element, which is very, very important, and I will explain you why, which is the carbon price or the carbon tax that you eventually paid in the country of origin. If you remember what I said at the very beginning, the CBAM, it's a climate policies with several different scopes. And one of the scope, it's also a political scope, let's say. The European Union is pushing third countries to implement national ETS or national policies to tackle the climate change, basically. And we also know that also India is working on this. They are designing, they started designing, let's say, the national ETS, but also the price inside this ETS will be relevant. Now the price in Europe, it's around 70 euros per ton of CO2 emitted, and the last average data of 1 ton of CO2 emitted in India is just $1.6. So it's completely a different kind of mechanism, a different compliant, different kind of obligations. But anyhow, keep in mind that also the carbon, the price of carbon that you might pay nationally will be an element of evaluation from the importer's point of view. So any supplier around the world is starting getting ready for this obligation. So it's starting preparing for the GHG accounting, considering the CBAM boundaries. Vivek is much better than me about this, so I will leave Vivek later on to explain you how to assess this problem. For sure, also, any exporter in the world is trying to understand how to decarbonize his own production, his own goods, because again, it's not the same a high level of embedded emission with a low level of embedded emission, because in this difference, there is the cost, the additional cost for importers, and of course, the last things that everybody is doing is understanding the national implementation of some climate policies. We put here some data about the value of the export from India to the European Union, and you can see we are talking about billions, and there is an example just for the iron and steel sector, which is the one on the right side. I mean, it's a little bit small, but we wanted just to give you an overview on the implication of the CBAM, because we are talking about a very big trade relationship between India and Europe. And keep in mind again that what we are doing now is just the beginning. So everything you will decide to do inside your own company will allow you to best perform in the next future with the European Union. I'm not going to deep dive so much about the national ETS. It will take, I mean, we would need much more time than the time we have today. So we just added some slides in this deck talking about the carbon credit trading scheme, which is a designing of a similar ETS in India that began a lot of years ago, began almost 20 years ago, that was let's say, strength in 2023. I mean, and you can see a similarity in the date with the date of the application of the CBAM regulation, because also Indian companies, they don't want to lose export, they don't want to lose their share of market in terms of export to European Union. And also from a political point of view, it's very interesting how to push for decarbonization, but also eventually to support the decarbonization of the national industries. You also have to consider, this I would say very high level, that each ETS in the world is different. I mean, ETS are designed considering different approaches in terms of the scope covered by the ETS. The Indian one was designed with a gate-to-gate approach covering emission along the entire value chain, and the carbon credit scheme scope will include direct emission from fuel combustion and industrial processes, as well as indirect emission from electricity and heat consumption. But this is exactly what is covered by the CBAM regulation. So it's a good news. I mean, what we are doing nationally, it will also help us for future obligation arising with the CBAM. Here we added a graph, an image about what's going on in the rest of the world. This is again something interesting because we need to keep our competitiveness on the market. So we need to understand our level of embedded emission, eventually what we are going to pay nationally, but what's going on outside, we need to have a look. And this map gives you an overlook of the ETS in the world. The blue are ETS implemented. So we have the European Union, of course. We have China, which is pushing a lot to maintain his role in the market, his predominance in the market in terms of export. We have Australia, we have something in the States, but you can see in green, which is the most interesting part of this image, how also other countries now are developing national ETS or carbon taxes. I mean, they want also to put a price on carbon emissions. The governance of the CBAM is, as you might understood now, for the importers. Again, we are just regulating the European importers. We cannot regulate something outside of our borders. So there are several different kind of players and actors within the CBAM regulation. But the exporters play a fundamental role because they have to give the data to the importer, and starting from 2026, as I said before, they also need to get the verification of the data they are providing to their importers. We don't have, as of today, a lot of information about the verification process. We just know that starting from the 1st of January of 2026, all the data we are giving to the importer should be verified, either directly from the exporters or eventually and potentially from the importer. But this is to say that what you are already doing now to, let's say, make your importer happy, it's something that you will need to strengthen in the next months, because it's leading, this CBAM regulation, it's leading to a very, very strict regulation also with verification of embedded emissions. And this is something very, very important. Now, the CBAM registry, which is the fundamental element of the CBAM, where all the information flows, it just open to importer. You can see this is just a screenshot, CBAM Transitional Registry link for importers. This will change in the next years because also exporters can enroll in the CBAM registry. They can have their own identity inside the CBAM registry in order also to make the process of sharing this information and also the verification side easier for everybody. Actually, the European Union is following exactly what we are doing in the UTS. Everything is centralized in a registry, and this will be also good for the CBAM regulation. Finally, even if today it's not relevant not even for your importers. So they are not really worried for today imports about the price of the CBAM certificates. They are starting understanding their compliance cycle. They have a quarterly obligation to report the embedded emission. These quarter reports normally are aggregated in a report of the year, and starting from 2026, they will need to buy CBAM certificates. And they will need to buy CBAM certificates with very specific rules. It is not a trading scheme, the CBAM. So they will need to buy quarterly at least the 80% of the CBAM representing the 80% of the embedded emissions. But they are starting now to make their budget. They need to understand how much it will be the additional cost for their own obligation inside the CBAM regulation. They need to forecast also their increased, let's say, financial flows. And so it makes sense that your importers is already asking you information and probably discussing also about other some other aspects that were not relevant as of today. As you can see, this is just to give you an idea of what is the report that the importer should provide to the national competent authorities. Their report includes a lot of information: the total goods they are importing, the total emissions, the goods emissions per unit, the installation details, the measurement type inside the installation, how the supplier is determining this information, the carbon price, how is this carbon price working, which is the legal act related to this, so that you need really to create a big flow of information with your importer. Now I will leave the floor to Vivek, which will deep dive inside the calculation of the embedded emission that, as we have seen, it's a fundamental part of your job, and it's what all the importers will require to use starting from now. Vivek.
Thank you very much, Pietro. This was definitely very engaging. I'll try to do my best to keep the audience engaged about this. So far, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. So far we had been listing everything about the EU CBAM, the why element of it, that why the CBAM is coming in picture, where the EU Fit for 55, the Green Deal, all of that stands in, and why there is a need for Indian exporters to really take that seriously, as it has a larger implication in terms of having the carbon tax implication on the goods that's getting landed into or within the EU custom boundary as such. What we are going to do now from here is to look into the aspect of how. So the aspect of how to look into the embedded emissions and everything around that aspect. And when we're talking about products, manufacturing units, various different type of products, how those products are classified, and basically everything around the embedded emission element is what we're going to look into. But before that, there is some amount of definitely, I would not use the word confusion, but yes, definitely there is a duality of aspects when it comes to carbon footprint. So I would like to just bring in your attention to this slide where we're talking about the whole carbon footprint. And when I say carbon footprint, definitely it includes the larger remit of greenhouse gases as usually represented by equivalents of carbon dioxide. But if we look at carbon footprint in totality, there are two elements which very clearly come out of that. One is, of course, where we look at the corporate carbon emission, right, which is on the blue box on the right, which typically captures every element.
Sorry, Vivek, I think we're not seeing the slide that you would like us to see.
Yes, I will try to do that again. Is this visible now to everyone? might take a moment.
Yes, we can't see properly because we see the entire sort of screen, not in a presenter.
Allow me 1 second. I just did a couple of clicks and probably now it should.
Yes, now yes, thank you.
Perfect. So I didn't cover much. This is just the very first slide of my talking. So when I'm talking about carbon emission, of course, the very first element comes is the corporate carbon emissions, which are done as per GG protocol. ISO standards are there, which is pretty much covering what all greenhouse gas emission, which the business as such, the corporate entity as such is throwing into the environment. So that's again, it's like an encompassing all activities of the business, whether they are burning some fuel or basically buying electricity, consuming electricity, and everything which is there in the value chain, right? All sort of raw material, the associated cost or associated elements of bringing those raw materials to the corporate. So all of that basically gets captured under scope 1, 2, 3. So that's one element of carbon emission. The other element comes down is when you go a little deep dive, or rather go little deep there within the corporate, that if a particular organization, a particular business is producing certain goods, certain products, then you wanted to really understand what is the overall carbon emission, right, which is associated with that particular product, which is again done as per multiple standards of product carbon footprint as per ISO 14067, or probably you're looking at the complete life cycle impact, the environmental impact larger of that product, which includes way bigger parameters than just greenhouse gases, where you look at toxicity and various different other elements, the implication of that products going out in the market, what sort of environmental impact largely it has, including greenhouse gas emissions. Now, when it comes to carbon border adjustment mechanism, here the EU objective, the Commission's objective is very clear. They wanting to understand that at an entity level, which is acting as an exporter, what is the set of product that entity is exporting into EU boundaries, and what the embedded emission, level of embedded emission, which is already engrossed or sort of engulfed into that particular product which is getting landed, right? So again, this is in some ways looks very, very synonymous to product carbon footprint or life cycle assessment, but there are definitely very, very fine differences. And that again, the Commission had come out very, very clearly in terms of how would you define what is the level of embedded emission that is associated with that particular product. And that's the reason why in this organogram you would see that it is falling below product carbon footprint, because there again, you are sort of tightening the boundaries, you are narrowing those boundaries very, very clearly, and then you are calculating the total carbon impact, or so to say in the word, the sort of embedded emission as such. So that the point that I was mentioning about, right, I mean, how the CBAM is really defining the boundary limits, right? So in this particular slide, we will look into a couple of aspects, and I'll then pick up like few of them in further details. If you look at the overall chevrons at the top, right, which talks about the whole process, every business goes through this value chain depending on what sort of product that they're making, but pretty much starts with the product, the sourcing of raw materials, right, which would definitely involve some amount of mining, transportation of those raw materials good to the factory site or to the site, the installation where the manufacturing is going to happen. Again, those raw materials sometimes can directly be utilized in the manufacturing process, or probably you need some treatment before that, right? A very simple example could be you pick up crude oil from the well site, and the crude oil is being shipped with a pipeline to a refinery. Now, after reaching to the refinery, it needs to be pre-treated, right? That pre-treatment is exactly what we are talking about, is the production of precursor. Only a pre-treated crude can go into a refinery stack, a distillation column, which you might have already seen somewhere. So that's about the pre-treatment or preparation of precursors, of production of precursors. Precursor, for that matter, you might have heard a lot about it in pharmaceutical industry, in chemical industry, right? You take a basic chemical and you basically prepare some sort of a solution after that. after some synthesis or chemical reactions, you prepare something which would be called as a precursor, which actually goes into the production process. So that's where the precursor thing comes in. Then after the precursor is ready, is you're looking at the production process as such, where the core of the product is getting manufactured, right? Your production line, probably in that case. Once the product is ready to move out of the factory gate is where it goes for the use stage. Again, it includes everything around the distribution, the transportation of that good, reaching to the user site, the user consumes that good, and after the consumption is where you reach to the end life of the product as such. Now, if I put a boundary limit in case of CBAM, what it covers is very, very specifically a facility, which is shown at the center here. The total overall emission which is coming from the processes which are related to the production of precursors and the production process itself. So these two stages are very, very clearly identified, including certain cases raw materials as well. And you calculate the complete emissions, the greenhouse gas emission associated with it on per unit produce or per unit of the production. So that's how you look at the complete sort of an embedded emission. As you can see that these system boundaries are referring everything which is written under GHG emission, and this within this blue dotted border, that would be falling under the category of embedded emission, which one needs to calculate. So the approach from the life cycle perspective, we are not even looking at the complete cradle to gate. We are looking at something after the cradle, something pre-prepared, and to the gate is what the philosophy, if from the system boundary perspective, you wanted to understand. Looking at basically what sort of information that one needs to generate the embedded emission is, of course, all the materials which are going into the production process, the energy flows in terms of what sort of energy intake in form of steam, heat, electricity, and any other input of further fuel burning that is required, right? Let's say you need coal or probably some other fuel in top, like sort of on top of the other energy, direct energy consumption. All of that needs to go into it. Beyond that, you would look at the other two aspects, which is around the upstream and downstream part of the activity of the business. Upstream activity, as I was discussing earlier, that everything to do with your production of the precursor good. Certain cases, you would consider even raw material extraction as well in that upstream process, like is in the case of if I talk about basically the steel sector for that matter. There, if you're talking about anything to do with iron ore mining, that would be forming part. However, in case of probably the aluminum production, the alumina mining, again, right, the bauxite mining as such, that is not part of the upstream process. Again, the commission had come out very, very specifically with respect to what sort of boundary limits for a specific set of product that needs to be set out. The other element that the plant needs to really be considering is about the apportionment, right? If you are producing from the same manufacturing plant, multiple different goods, all of them falling under the category of CBAM, and you have, let's say, just one production line, right? In that scenario, you need to really apportion based on the production. So based on mass, again, the weight of the production or any other volumetric unit. Based on that, you need to apportion the whole embedded emission calculated from the production process onto that specific products which are getting out from the installation as such. Coming to the next aspect in terms of the CBAM goods. Before even going there, I would like to just touch upon very briefly type of goods, right? We must have already seen that there are a set of goods which are probably cement, fertilizer, iron, steel, aluminum, chemicals, hydrogen, electricity. All of that has been categorized under the current set of regulation where you need to, if you are into production of any such material, which are listed out here and landing into Europe boundary, in that case, it would be categorized under CBAM and you need to provide the embedded emission. But if we look at CBAM goods, how the goods being described, there are two types of goods, right? A sort of a simple CBAM good or a complex CBAM good. Again, some confusion around there. I'd like to sort of clarify here. Simple goods, as the name suggests, is a pretty simple, straightforward process, very established process, limited set of raw materials that you need to produce the simple good as such. Though the name suggests simple good, but typically you would see most heavily used products such as all of these like cement, fertilizer, iron, aluminum, hydrogen. all of them fall into the category of simple goods. Why for that matter? But if you look into it, cement, like the cement production pretty much needs a single process called calcination, right? You do calcination of clinkers and basically the cement production happens at a particular reaction temperature to be maintained, and then you generate cement. Same is the case in the case of fertilizer, right? What you're talking about here is the ammonia production and probably nitric acid, right? So those two basic, very predefined processes, you are deploying that and generating your good, which would fall into the category of CBAM, but will be called as simple good in that matter. On the other hand, complex good, as the name suggests, the complex good, the good itself is complex from the perspective that it entails multiple raw materials and inputs to go into. A simple example would be smartphones that we carry, right? It has got thousands of elements gone into that small device in your hand, multiple ICs, screens, microphones, and think of it, the sort of value chain that all those items would have, right? Somebody might be just making a small chip, somebody might be making a memory card. So there are a very complex value chain involved in production of one particular smartphone, and hence it is called as complex good. So if we can look into on the right side, basically the goods where only direct emissions would be required. As you can see that there's a table, and we'll be sharing this as well later, that what sort of emission that needs to be captured. All the goods which are falling under iron, steel, aluminum, hydrogen, all of that, it's only direct emission. Direct emission, as we understand that, whatever goes in form of energy or consumption that you're doing, all that would be falling under the category of direct emission. So that needs to be captured in that case. Moving on from here, on the calculation as such, if you're looking at embedded emissions, the formula is pretty much the same, whether it's a simple good or it's a complex good. The formula talks about it that you need to calculate the attributed emission. Again, the way I was talking about it earlier, if you've got multiple goods being produced under the category, let's say good G1, G2, G3, G4, there are multiple goods, you pick up that good, attribute the overall emission, which is with the process, and basically attribute that total emission onto the good based on the volumetric proportions. That's the total attributed emission. Then we are talking about the embedded emission with respect to the input material. Input material, as I talked, that it would include basically the input material of various different sorts, right? Again, in case of, if I take a simple example of, let's say, steel rods production. The steel rods production starts from a basics raw material like iron ore, right? Which comes from mining of probably hematite or magnetite. You do that mining. Then the next step goes into smelting. The smelting is all about basically you mix that iron ore with limestone, with coke, and then you make the pig iron. The pig iron becomes a precursor here. The raw material is iron ore. Again, as I was mentioning earlier, in this case, particularly in case of steel production, raw material is included in part of embedded emission, including the precursors like pig iron. From pig iron, you do the refining, and then you come up with sort of a molten steel. All those intermediate products, which are finally going into taking molten steel and basically doing sort of rolling and milling and all the exercise and creating a steel rod, all those precursors would also be included, and you need to calculate separately for every precursor what is the sort of embedded emission associated with it. Now, for precursor, as you can see, the below equation tells very clearly that every precursor on mass basis, you would be calculating their specific emission and coming up with the overall calculations. So this is how you do it for the simple good. In case of complex good, here we are talking about thousands of input materials, right? Not just one, but thousands. And you would be calculating for every input material in the similar fashion. You would be identifying that all embedded emissions and then attributing, like included with the attributed emission of that good, you would calculate the total specific embedded emission. So that's the overall approach that's been taken. Now, if I go back into what sort of reporting requirement is there, it basically it says that there are two ways to calculate your embedded emission. Of course, based on the activity, which is that you have the overall energy balance, you have the mass balance available, you have all the raw materials, the precursors, all that is available. You're adding them up in terms of the total mass balance equation and calculating at every stage what is the sort of emission that is being generated, right? All that would add up into the embedded emission. that's one way of doing it. The second way is, of course, to having a proper monitoring in place. So where you have a continuous measurement of greenhouse gas emission based on the flue gas, because whatever flue gas that you're generating, you're basically doing a chromatography, identifying that what sort of carbon emission is included in it. And based on that monitoring, you are coming up with the embedded emission. Now, these two approaches are provided. However, Commission knows very clearly that having a monitoring at every stage of your production would be a little challenging to start with. And that's where until 2 quarters of this year, right, until Q1 and Q2 of calendar year of 2024, it was allowed that you can use default values. Like Commission has come up with default values of tons of CO2 per ton of steel, of aluminium, of various different precursors. So you can just simply use that to start with and provide what is the embedded emission in your export. You exporting 100 tons of steel rods, you have steel rods default value, you provide total embedded emission with that. But beyond this, which is starting July, is where you would be expected to come up with very clearly by the rule of 80-20. Only 20% of your embedded emission can be relying on the default values. The balance 80% has to come up with either of the two approaches, right? Either activity-based or based on the overall emission, sort of effluent emission calculation basis. So that's the approach that you typically take here. And that's where I would leave it back to Pietro to carry forward with the strategies and engagement.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Give one second that I take again the control. I think you should see it now. So moving to the last part of this webinar, 1 hour is never enough to deep dive inside the CBAM, and I think that Vivek was explaining very well what are the boundaries of the calculation and how to approach the calculation, also replying to some questions that I've seen. I would like to close this webinar with some strategies and engagements insights, because as we said at the very beginning, we started working on the CBAM almost a couple of years ago, and both for importers and exporters. So I want to give you also the importers' point of view, which is maybe a little bit different from yours, but because you have really to understand their needs and eventually the consequences of not fulfilling the needs of the importers. Basically now importers are starting the engagement with suppliers to get, as Vivek was saying, the actual data on embedded emissions. In the very first 3 reports, CBAM reports, they could use default values. So this flow of information was not really relevant, let's say, but now they need to get the actual data of the embedded emissions. So the exporters are also suggesting how to best calculate the embedded emissions, and also importers normally are trying to check the accuracy of the CN codes of imported goods, because this is very, very relevant. I mean, as of today, we were not really taking care about the CN codes because there were no any kind of special tax applying to these, but now also importers are trying to understand also if the CN code is correct. Of course, they are monitoring how the development of ETS outside the European Union is going, and this makes a lot of sense because now the evaluation of any good imported, its price, quality, level of embedded emission, and the price of carbon paid outside the European Union. This is because they might get a discount in terms of CBAM, in terms of quantity of CBAM certificates they have to buy and surrender. And of course, importers are also checking the accuracy in choosing the date of import of the good, because the general rules about the CBAM, it's about the release of goods inside the European Union. So they may a little bit try to hedge the cost, trying to foresee the price also of the potential cost of the CBAM certificates. On the other side, of course, the suppliers, and so you have a lot to do. You have really a lot of work to do because, first of all, in the slides shown by Vivek, it was very clear how the boundaries of the CBAM are specific boundaries and you need to follow specific rules. These rules are exactly the same rules of the MRV regulation for European installation under the UATS, with a big difference. At the European level, we collect the overall emission of the installation. From your point of view, you have to report the embedded emission of that specific good exported to the European Union. So normally exporters are mapping their export, checking again the CN codes, understanding the processes behind any kind of goods, understanding if they are complex or simple goods, and also understanding, and this is the very difficult part, understanding how to engage with the supply chain, because if you're not managing an industrial process, you should get some information you need specifically about your precursors from other companies. So basically exporters now are requiring us to create a clear methodology for the calculation of the embedded emissions and all the parameters of this calculation. So with all the elements that Vivek was saying. On the other side, besides the calculation of the embedded emission, they are keeping an eye on the development on national policies and carbon prices they are paying. The information normally is requested from the importers using a template that it was created by the European Commission, and we can share with you, of course, if you don't know this template. The template is not mandatory, and this template probably it's similar to other templates that you can also download, for instance, from the GHG protocol website. I mean, it's a template that helps you out to calculate in the right way the level of the embedded emissions with the final scope to give the embedded emission of the goods and only to the good that you are exporting. So most of the importers now are asking their suppliers to use this template. And I think that even if it's not mandatory, it's much better to use this template. And I tell you why. Since the collection of this information from supplier, it's complicated. In the last report, so the one that was delivered by the end of October, a lot of importers were struggling about the actual data on embedded emission. And finally, some national competent authorities said to the importers that at least even if they didn't get the real value, they should demonstrate that they did their best to collect this information. And one of the examples was to have sent to the supplier these templates. So I expect that everyone, all the importers will send it to you, this template. Of course, when you know how to fulfill this template, you can do the same kind of job with all the importers and you can share this information. So even if it's not mandatory, it's very useful for you to start to get familiar with this template, which is an easy to fulfill template if you're really already monitoring your emission at any level of your process or your companies. Besides that, and besides all the training that we can also provide to you and all the work that we can do with you, the European Commission has created several guidance documents. There are several videos, several PDFs that you can download from the European Commission website that guide you, that should guide importers and exporters to understand better what they have to do and what they are supposed to do. There are also the guidance for non-EU exporter is translated to many languages, so you can access also these kind of resources. For sure, you should assess on your clients' need. You should develop probably some awareness program inside your company, and you have finally to start your GHG accounting. This is what it's the minimum requirements from any point of view. So I will leave the floor to Nika now to go on with the Q&A.
Thank you, Petro and Vivek, for the valuable insight you shared today. We now open the floor for the Q&A session. Kindly drop your queries in the Q&A section and we will address as many as possible today. We already have one question from Aditya Malviya. What is the meaning of mass balance in Excel and how one calculate? Please give one example also.
Sure, Neha. So if I can take that up. Sure. So Aditya, thank you very much for the question. So mass balance is basically one of the ways by which you really look at your inputs and outputs. So say we are talking about in case of Excel, that if you are trying to do that, you need to really break open your whole process into all the inputs, and basically you have to look at the output. The mass balance typically says that if you're putting let's say taking a case of a steel rod production, as I was giving earlier. So you produce let's say 1 ton of steel. To produce 1 ton of steel, how much iron ore that has gone, that would be forming part of your inputs, right? Along with the iron ore, when you're looking at probably the coking coke coal that would be required to put in the process of smelting, the limestone, the amount of that going as an input, you preparing pig iron, and from there basically you consider all the inputs, adding them up in terms of the mass value in the values in terms of tons or kgs or whatever it is, and then you look at the output, which is a ton of steel. So this is mass balance, meaning to say that the mass never like sort of extinct, right? We know that the Einstein theory, right? Mass never extincts. Whatever you would have put in, it would transform into something, or it would create some sort of a byproduct, or it would create some sort of a effluent stream or waste material. So you need to really look into your process from input to output, and you balance out the whole mass, right? You put all the conversions in terms of the molecular weights and look into all that elements and come up with the overall balanced equation of input mass is equivalent of the output mass. So that's what the whole thing about the mass balance. Thanks, Neha. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Vivek, for explaining this so beautifully. We have another question actually. I will just read it out. Is this CBAM required agriculture product like fruits and vegetables?
If I can jump in, the answer is no. The goods included were mentioned in the slides. They are related to cement, iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizer, chemicals, electricity and nitrogen, but it's a very limited specific requirements. And probably also in the future, agricultural product will not be included in the CBAM regulation because there is not a specific provision, not even a stated policies in Europe. So the answer is no. And first, you need to really inside the regulation you have the CM codes, but the aggregated categories are the one I was mentioning before.
Okay, thanks a lot, Petro. We have a lot of questions actually right now. I will just read it out. What is the timeline for CBAM extended to other chemical products?
There is no clear timeline because the European Commission wants first to understand if the mechanism as it is designed is working. So we are expecting a review of all the system in terms of functionality by 2028. The idea of the extension to other goods it's at least by 2038. Even if the European Commission level, you will never know if they will speed up the process, but the regulation as it is today is the only thing that we know and we should follow.
Okay, there's another question about, in these slides we have mentioned about carbon emission. What does PCF mean?
Neha, I can take that. So PCF means the product carbon footprint, and product carbon footprint is calculated as per the guidelines given by ISO 14067. I'll just add up in terms of the difference between the LCA and PCF is, while LCA is looking into everything including greenhouse gas emission, on the other environmental parameters as well, product carbon footprint focuses very, very clearly on the carbon emissions, right? Basically the greenhouse gas emissions. So that's where the PCF comes from. PCF comes from.
Okay, thanks a lot for explaining this, Vivek. We have another question actually. For embedded emission calculation, if the manufacturer, okay, fine, there are actually a lot of questions. So I'll just read out this one. For embedded emission there's another question from Aparna. She's working as a consultant to the MSME department, Government of Tamil Nadu, India. My question are, what will be the impact of CBAM in the Indian MSME sector? Also, since Indian and MSME are familiar with HSN code, how can we facilitate the integration and awareness of CN codes? Are there existing frameworks or resources to support this transaction? Support the transition? How does EU plan to ensure fair implementation of CBAM for MSME in developing countries like India?
So I will give some answer, Aparna. Thanks for the question. It's very, very interesting. Yes, the consequences on MSME, it's quite interesting because if they are exporting, they need to provide this data. The exemption for the importers are very, very limited in terms of value of the imported goods. So the threshold is set very, very, very low. But the European Commission is understanding that for very small companies, this can be complicated. So normally they are trying to figure out, also with national government outside the EU, how to manage this. For sure, we can provide you with the corresponding table from the different codes. So after this webinar, if you can send an email to any one of the team or to Neha, we will share with you the correspondence table, so it will be easier for you to access. About the EU plan to ensure fair implementation, this is a tricky question, so I will give you an insight. We have been participating in some awareness programs for small and medium enterprises outside the European Union, financed by the European Commission. I don't know what's the relationship with the European Commission about that. I know there are a lot of funds also about this, and basically also a request from India at the very beginning was that some of the money that the European Commission was collecting through the CBAM implementation should be used to create this program. So our better suggestion, and also we can help you out with this, is to try to identify some possible funding from the European Commission to create awareness program that basically it's what we are doing also with other countries.
Thanks a lot, Petro. There's another question on carbon neutrality or PCF. Is this same?
So I'll take this up, Neha. Carbon neutrality, now it's the next step, right? Carbon neutrality is more when you're looking into buying out some sort of environmental sort of attributes certificate, right? In form of carbon credits or in form of IREX, or in case of EU, it is EU ETS. So while the first step is to establish a product carbon footprint, or say corporate carbon footprint, or as per CBAM embedded emission. Once you establish it, that how much tons of CO2 is attributing towards your product, is where you can then look at multiple ways of neutralizing that amount of emission by buying these environmental attribution certificates, right, of various different categories. That could lead the product towards carbon neutrality. So yeah, I mean, that way they are two different concepts altogether.
Thanks a lot, Vivek. There's another question. I'll just read it out. For embedded emission calculation, If the manufacturer possesses EPD of the product A1 to A3, it should be providing the required information for CBAM declaration. So, any clarification on that part?
Sure. I can take this up. So basically, as I was mentioning earlier, right, while under the carbon emission, there are multiple synonymous or appearing that as same sort of philosophies, right? When you're talking about EPD, the environmental product declaration is based on a life cycle assessment study as per ISO 14040 or 44, and basically based on that, now again, during the life cycle of the product, you define the system boundaries as per the ISO standards. If I take a leap of faith here and say that while somebody is already having EPD or LCA calculations done, it can be leveraged heavily to work on the EPD, to work on the CBAM compliance requirement, but it cannot be completely replaced with, because as you can see that within CBAM, the requirements of setting up a system boundary for precursors, for raw materials changes for product to product, and hence you need to really reevaluate that what needs to be included in it. But definitely it's a sort of a CBAM is a sort of a subset to a larger LCA study which looks into everything, which I was showing earlier in the slide as well.
Thank you, Vivek. I'll just check if there are some more questions. Someone is asking about the GHG template, and so we will email you the template. Please share your email ID in the chat section. I'll wait for a couple of more minutes, and then I think we can conclude the webinar. If you have any more questions, please feel free to put that in the Q&A section.
I think it was a lot of information. They need to process now.
Okay, so as there are no more questions, we can conclude the session here. And as promised, we will share the ebook on CBAM and today's presentation deck with you shortly. I would like to extend a heartfelt thank you to everybody for attending. Please keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars, where we will continue to explore the critical facets of environmental sustainability and strategies to navigate these challenges effectively. Thank you all for joining us today and being part of this insightful session. We look forward to seeing you for our next webinar. Thank you, everyone, once again, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye.
thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining in. Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.